Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to wait a couple of minutes as we let the room fill in. So just hang out and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. So just hang out. We're letting the room fill in. So just hang in there. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. So just hang in there. We'll get started shortly. Just letting the room fill in. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. We're just letting the room fill in a little. We'll get started shortly. Thank you. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started now that the room's more full. So I just want to welcome everyone and say thank you for joining us for the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. If you're having any trouble, please drop that into the chat. Maybe we can try to fix that there. But I want to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our members through events such as these, with volunteer opportunities and throughout different campaign engagements. And now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A as we go throughout the presentation, but we won't cover those questions until the end. We'll have a portion at the end. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why Tech Equity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. But first, we're going to talk about why we're here. So Tech Equity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of all the problems all around us. And they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions to address these issues. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that our affordability crisis only gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result of the pandemic has a potential to even further exacerbate inequality within our region that we were already feeling. And because of this affordability crisis, our communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, my whole life, I've grown up in the Bay Area and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success, but I also have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them and their well being. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that further divides our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. And while we're all unsure as to how we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. And more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. We have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors and those around us, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in a time of such uncertainty. So, this is the state of our housing crisis in the Bay Area. The fact that rents are rising, I don't think is a surprise to anyone on this call because we already all know, we feel this, we hear about this every day. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants has actually decreased slightly. And it's really a sharp contrast to the narrative of tech success and without tech at the table to work together and address our shared crisis. It's understandable that why communities are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just to keep it more in context, before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked up to 16%, which was a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So, in the span of about a month or two, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At Tech Equity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. And we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At Tech Equity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done the great first step by joining onto this conversation and hearing about our region's issues and getting a little bit more education and history on the background of these issues. So our goal at Tech Equity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate cultures and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these very big problems and engage in the system change in three major ways. So, our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live, and we have various forms of educational content, material, and events, such as book club discussions, panel discussions with experts, webinars such as these, and voter guides during voting seasons. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, in which Tech Equity participated with other organizations to help pass a bill that would extend protections to over 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in our broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. But engaging tech workers is key. Tech workers have outsized political power that is largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. And connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in the products we're developing, and in surrounding communities. At Tech Equity, we focus on two issue areas, and those are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, and we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades has set us up for this level of pain our communities are feeling now, especially during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image on the screen. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that's by no accident. The hazardous rating was in large part based on racial demographics. So, in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and it was a racist policy. And it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. Consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And often the communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in really is decades in the making. It predates tech and it's not unique to the Bay Area. There are many cases of redlining all throughout California and all throughout the United States. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and communities that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived within those red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And so an income shock can be anything like a huge rent increase, sudden loss of a job, or the consequences of a pandemic like we have right now. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic. Many of the people within our communities were already struggling. And with unemployment on a steep rise and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So as we can see, the hourly pay for workers, what this chart is showing us is that the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased by 6 times. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019. So what does that mean? That means that the union coverage rate is now less than half than where it was 40 years ago. So as you can see, there there aren't many increases in wages, and there aren't many increases in worker protections. So the cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage then fares in our current rental market. So as I mentioned, the cost of living here was already high. So this is what it takes to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom apartment working a regular 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you'd need to work 40 hours a day to be able to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're creating and setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And just to keep it in context, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford San Francisco. There's a common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success and in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands and thousands of contingent workers and contracted workers like security guards, custodians, and cooks who are working long hours to maintain tech companies but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to be able to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, or RHNA, and it stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job in meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that huge bar on the right side. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about earlier. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you, we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while high income folks are coming in and staying in. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise and increase as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. So as you can see, this starts from 2016, and we don't know yet the full extent of the impact of the pandemic has on displacement in the Bay Area. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community to address issues like what we just talked about in the previous slides. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. We can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems, but we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living in today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So we need to make sure that we're building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that we're protecting existing tenants from being displaced. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are being upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection, because many of our neighbors are at risk now more than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits, regardless of the role workers are in. So we need to make sure that workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouses, and contracted work. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we've created a standard that tech companies should implement for contracted workers, which include creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure that their workplace is safe, and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards, and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, and not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our safety social net so that no one falls through our cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational events. So we have a model minority myth panel discussion coming up and a Black homeownership and racial divide event coming up. So I'll be talking about those events shortly in a bit. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation that we are organizing our membership around, including a rental registry. So we'll also be talking about that in a bit, just as a heads up. And for corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved with on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email after this, and you can reply to our follow-up email and we'll connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as easy and as accessible as possible to plug in, but while building community in the process. And this year, in 2021, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical workforce practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? You can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Or you can take action by supporting us on the rental registry and other priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So the first action you can take with us is to become a community endorser of rental registry by signing our petition, which will be linked in the follow-up email afterwards. So just for context, California currently does not have a statewide rental registry, so no one really knows the scale of the housing crisis in California in the rental market as well. So we're not currently tracking crucial data like the number of evictions, illegal rent hikes, and violation of tenant rights. And so the bill number is AB 1188. It's authored by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. This bill would collect vital data in jurisdictions across the state, allowing for transparency for tenants, accountability for landlords, and help bring forth better policies that are backed by concrete data that this bill would collect. You can also take action on various other pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So there's quite a few, as you can see on the screen. And we've decided to focus our advocacy on these bills because they will do the most to ensure an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available for all Californians. And so if you'd like more information on these bills, I'll be including links to each so you can have more information. You can sign on as community endorsers as well. So as I mentioned, we have two events coming up in the next couple of weeks, which you can register for free on Thursdays, 12 to 1 p.m. Our first event is the Model Minority Myth, How Anti-Asian Racism Persists in Tech. So we'll talk about how, as a society, we've largely ignored and stayed silent about racism against Asian American and Pacific Islander people. And much of that silence has been rooted in the destructive and divisive model minority myth, which is deeply embedded within the tech industry. So if you'd like tickets for that one, that's happening Thursday, April 8th, 12 to 1 p.m. And the second event is Black home ownership and the racial divide. So we'll give an overview of the longstanding history of systemic racism, redlining, segregation, and exclusionary housing policies that have stood in the way of Black homeownership for decades. So we'll talk about what policy solutions we can advance to create pathways for Black homeownership. So like I said, those two events are coming up in the next couple of weeks. Both are going to be panel discussions with experts on these topics, and you all can get your tickets online. Also will be linked on the email we send out afterwards. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, tell a friend about what you learned today, your thoughts on the presentation, and just share that our org exists. Share it with your coworkers, with your family, people everywhere. You can become a member of TechEquity for $10 a month or $100 a year and support us financially. Or you can take action with us if it's either coming to an event that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks, signing on as a community endorser for the various petitions, or joining us for volunteer opportunities as they arise. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So now is the time for questions. So if you have questions, please drop those into the Q&A. Like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this presentation. We'll send out the slides and we'll send out links to everything that we talked about today. If you think of a question later, you can always reply back to that email and I'll also get back to you personally on that. So I'll just take a minute to see if anyone has any questions or any comments. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Oh, we have one person asking, do y'all ever have volunteering opportunities? We do have volunteering opportunities. At the moment, our first engagement is signing petitions. So we have a couple of bills that are moving through the legislative cycle. And as those bills are moving, we'll have various different volunteering opportunities available. So that's the first action you can take. Just to give you an example of past volunteer opportunities we've hosted phone banking sessions that were virtual. We've hosted pre-pandemic signature gatherings, and we have just tons of other volunteer opportunities. So if you're interested and you're not really sure where to plug in, reply to the follow-up email and I'll get back to you and plug you in. We have another person asking, what legislation are you most excited for this year? I think for me, the legislation I'm most excited for is AB 1188. So the rental registries. I think it's just very crucial for decision makers to make decisions that are backed by data. Like you have to have an idea of what's going on out there before you're making decisions. And this bill has the potential to be like the number one data source for any decision that's made on housing. And so it's super important. And I think that that's something everyone should keep an eye out for. Once again, that's AB 1188, authored by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, the rental registry. I'll send out more information about it before on the follow-up email. Great. So not seeing anything else. So I just want to thank everyone for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movements. Like I said, keep an eye out for that follow-up email. Hope to see you at a future volunteer opportunity, a future event, and just continue engaging with us in whatever capacity, way, or form you can. So I just want to thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for coming.